Okay, so now I want to talk about another neurotransmitter that you have undoubtedly heard of, which is dopamine. And dopamine is a very important neurotransmitter that, like acetylcholine, is manufactured from a very commonly available, kind of raw material in your brain and body. It's manufactured from one of the 20 amino acids that are used to build up every protein machine that we've been discussing in this class. From channels to transporters to enzymes. And the amino acid from which dopamine is manufactured is one that's called tyrosine. Tyrosine is the amino acid that serves as the raw material for the manufacture of dopamine. Now, dopamine is manufactured from tyrosine in two steps. So there's an enzyme, a synthesizing enzyme, right, in neurons that are going to release dopamine. Those neurons will actually express the gene for the synthesizing enzymes that grab onto tyrosine and convert it into this intermediate kind of product, this intermediate chemical called L-DOPA, right? And then the second synthesizing enzyme that's expressed in neurons that release dopamine grabs onto the L-DOPA, right? And then tweaks it and converts it into dopamine. So it's this sort of two-step synthesis process, going from tyrosine to L-DOPA and then from L-DOPA to dopamine. Now, dopamine is a particular kind of neurotransmitter. We refer to it again as a monoamine, which means it's got, one mono amino group. And, of course it's going to have an amino group because it was manufactured from an amino acid, right? So it is a monoamine like the other monoamines that I've mentioned previously, norepinephrine and also serotonin. These are also manufactured from amino acids. And the reason I'm telling you this is that they share, certain structural feature. So there's some similarities amongst the different monoamines in terms of, for example, if you design a drug that will influence a dopamine receptor, well, the drug may have, some sort of action at, a norepinephrine receptor because, your drug, if it can act at a dopamine receptor, it must share some certain physical structural features with, the neurotransmitter dopamine. And dopamine shares some features with norepinephrine and also with serotonin. Dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin, are the monoamines. They've got the one amino group. But dopamine and norepinephrine share another structural feature. It's this ring called a catechol ring that you can sort of see on this overhead. So dopamine and norepinephrine are even more closely, allied structurally, and they're together referred to as the catecholamine neurotransmitters. So dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, all monoamines. Dopamine and norepinephrine share an additional structural feature, that catechol ring. So they're also catecholamine, called catecholamine neurotransmitters. Now, dopamine is very important for two, sort of behavioral or, kind of aspects of an organism. Very important for movement. Whenever you're making some kind of a movement, remember we got acetylcholine out here in the periphery that's actually at the neuromuscular junction. But in terms of monitoring and kind of generating movement in the brain, in systems in the brain, networks in the brain that are involved in movement, dopamine is a very important neurotransmitter. In fact, if a particular nucleus that is the source of dopamine input into some of these brain networks that are necessary for movement degenerates and you get less dopamine, well, you develop slowness of movement and even the inability to initiate movement, which is called akinesia. Slowness of movement is bradykinesia. You'll develop tremor. All sorts of movement disturbances are a result of the loss of dopamine in a specific network. The other important kind of behavioral role for dopamine is in sort of stimulating and encouraging motivated behavior. Whenever you want to do something, whenever you're driven to do something or engaged in something, there's significant dopamine being released. And we can, to some extent, sort of separate out the networks that underlie each of these two sort of functional attributes of dopamine release. For example, the disorder that I alluded to that involves tremor and slowness of movement movement, or bradykinesia, lack of movement, akinesia, is known as Parkinson's disease, and it results from degeneration of a very specific brainstem nucleus. Remember, a collection of neuron cell bodies and the associated dendrites, whose axons then project out to other areas of the brain, particularly to other nuclei that are sort of interconnected, below the level of the cortex. So it's a set of subcortical nuclei that are collectively referred to as the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia are a set of interconnected subcortical nuclei that are very important for movement. And the substantia nigra is this brainstem, nucleus. It's considered to be part of the basal ganglia, but it projects axons and they release dopamine onto other nuclei that make up the basal ganglia. So with degeneration of the substantia nigra, and pretty substantial degeneration, I mean, you have to lose about 70% of the neurons, the dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra before you start to become aware of movement symptoms. Typically, you develop a disorder known as Parkinson's disease. Now, there's another brainstem source of dopamine release elsewhere in the brain. Another brainstem nucleus, that contains the cell bodies of neurons that are going to, send their axons out of the brainstem and make, connections, make synaptic connections with other locations, other parts of the cerebrum. And this second nucleus is referred to as the VTA. And the VTA sends out two sort of major projections. One of them, these are axons leaving from the cell bodies of dopamine neurons that are found in this nucleus called the VTA. These axons leave the brainstem and course forward, and they make connections with structures that are important for emotional experience and expression. They're part of what we refer to in what we'll discuss later as the limbic system. And they include structures like the hypothalamus, for example, and also a particular nucleus, subcortical nucleus, called the nucleus accumbens. Okay, this particular pathway is referred to as the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. It originates in the VTA and projects into limbic structures like the hypothalamus and the nucleus accumbens. And there's also a VTA projection further, forward in the brain into the frontal lobe, into what we call the prefrontal cortex. And this is referred to as the mesocortical dopamine pathway. So the mesolimbic and mesocortical pathways that originate in the VTA are very important for motivated behavior. Whenever you are kind of enthused or engaged, you actually encounter stimuli that get you to respond with motivated behavior, to sort of seek it out and go for it, you're going to see enhanced dopamine release. In prefrontal cortex, nucleus accumbens, hypothalamus, you're going to see more activity along the mesolimbic and mesocortical networks. Now, the pathway that originates in the other dopamine nucleus in the brainstem, the substantia nigra, and projects into other nuclei, that are components of this set of interconnected subcortical nuclei called the basal ganglia, right? This is called the nigro because it's starting in the substantia nigra, right? And it's going into a subset of those basal ganglia nuclei that are referred to as the striatum. Striatum is just another set of, subset of nuclei that are part of the larger basal ganglia. And the dopamine projections from the substantia nigra, in the brainstem, project not to every nucleus in the basal ganglia, but only to the striatal nuclei, right? The nuclei that form the striatum. This pathway is called the nigrostriatal pathway, and degeneration of that nigrostriatal pathway is associated with the development of movement disorders, particularly Parkinson's disease. Okay.